Well, howdy everyone. Today I've got a lens which has always done well on the market, but hasn't been reviewed on the internet very much. The Tamron 70-300mm f4-5.6 DI macro lens. This is a really old lens now, but it's still of interest to a lot of people as it's pretty much the cheapest telephoto lens that money can buy, only costing about £100 new or about £60 on eBay, so about $100. Don't confuse this with Tamron's much newer 70-300mm VC USD lens, which has proved to be a good performer when I reviewed it a couple of months ago. This baby is very cheap and old school. Let's take a look. The lens is compatible with all of Canon's digital SLR cameras. Considering that it's designed to be compatible with full-frame cameras, it's a little smaller and lighter than you might expect. It has a cheap plastic lens mount, but overall the lens is quite tightly put together. The zoom ring is quite stiff and jerky to use, which is a bit annoying, and it turns the opposite way round from normal Canon lenses, which can take a bit of getting used to. The focus ring isn't damped, but it turns fairly smoothly. It doesn't have a long travel path though, so precise focusing can be very difficult. The autofocus on this lens is pretty awful. It works very slowly while noisily whining in complaint. If you try and use autofocus in macro mode, it takes about 2 full seconds to go from the nearest to furthest point. I was wondering why the focus path on this lens is so short, but then I realised that the autofocus would take even longer, if you can imagine that. Annoyingly, the front element of the lens twists and pulls while it's doing this, which is a pain for people using polarizing or graduating filters. This is probably the most old-fashioned autofocus system I've seen on a modern camera lens, and using it gets annoying pretty quickly. It doesn't even always focus accurately, sometimes missing the mark and leaving you with soft pictures. This is what photography in the 1990s must have been like. One point of redemption is that the lens has a pretty good macro mode, which gives you a 1:2 magnification ratio, making it halfway to being a true macro lens. This is a nice feature. The picture quality with the aperture at f5.6 is very soft, but stop the lens down to f8 and the quality becomes pretty good. Actually using the macro mode is a bit awkward. First you have to get the lens between 180 and 300mm. Then switch it to macro mode. This will leave your lens locked past 180mm until you focus back again past 1.5 meters. Most of the time you have to switch the lens to manual focus to do this yourself, which is a bit clumsy. This is essentially the same awkward lens design of the Sigma 70-300mm APO lens, which I reviewed a little while ago, and I had a few choice words to say about it back then which seemed to upset a few people. So all I'll say now is that I do like this lens's macro mode, but its bizarre implementation is a pain. So handling this lens can be a pretty ugly experience, but seeing as it's the cheapest telephoto lens on the market, you can't really be too disappointed. You really do get what you pay for. Let's take a look at the all-important picture quality. All these shots were taken on my Canon 60D with its 18-megapixel APS-C sized sensor. Let's start by zooming all the way out to 70mm. With the aperture wide open at f4, the lens is fairly sharp in the center with little chromatic aberration, and the corners are the same. However, the lens suffers from very large amounts of purple fringing, as you can see here in the window frames. It really is on a rampage, and you can see it clearly in everyday pictures, such as this. Anyway, stop the lens down to f5.6, and thankfully the purple fringing clears up, revealing some magenta chromatic aberration. But at least the lens is pretty sharp now, staying about the same as you stop down to f8. As you can see, the middle is very sharp indeed, so the lens gives a good performance at 70mm when it's stopped down. Let's zoom in a bit to 120mm, where the maximum aperture is still f4, which is a little wider than usual for a 70-300mm lens. At f4, the story in the middle is about the same. There is good sharpness, but heavy purple fringing. When we look in the corners, we can see that things are a little worse than at 70mm. We can see a mixture of softness, purple fringing, and chromatic aberration. Stopping down to f5.6 improves pretty much everything, and at f8 the chromatic aberration is nearly all gone and the picture is fairly sharp in the corners. Look back to the middle of the image and we can see that the lens has become very sharp there too. Now let's zoom in to 200mm. The maximum aperture now is f4.5, so again it's letting in a little more light than the average 70 to 300mm lens. But the picture quality is unimpressive. Things are still okay in the middle, except for that unstoppable purple fringing. But if we look in the corners, again we see softness and strong green and purple chromatic aberrations which are easily visible in any picture. Stopping down to f5.6 doesn't help much, and it's only at f8 and f11 that we see some decent sharpness. But the chromatic aberration is still there, and you don't really want to stop the lens down too much at 200mm because the lack of image stabilization means you might get really blurry images. The saving grace is that the middle of the picture is pretty sharp by now, but still not as good as other lenses. Well, let's finally zoom in all the way to 300mm. Because of the inaccurate autofocus and the short travel path of the focus ring, it took a long time for me to get the best possible test pictures. With the aperture wide open at f5.6, in the middle of the frame, the picture is a bit soft with, you guessed it, purple fringing. Again, the corners are very soft with very strong chromatic aberration. Stopping the lens down to f8 brings a mild improvement, as does f11, but the corner performance remains very poor. The picture quality in the middle, even at f11, is still decidedly below average. Bearing in mind that it was quite a struggle to get the pictures in focus in the first place because of the build quality of this lens, and you can tell this is not a lens which is very rewarding to use. This is basically a lens which struggles with the idea of image quality. With a bit of effort you can get some decent resolution out of it, and sometimes it's even quite sharp. But sharpness isn't everything, and there's nearly always a ghost at the feast. At wider angles there's rampant purple fringing and softness when the aperture is wide open, and as you zoom in you can add to that some very strong chromatic aberration and even more softness in the corners. You have to stop the lens down to f8 or f11 to get nice image quality, but on a telephoto lens without any image stabilization, those very narrow apertures make it even harder for you to get the fast shutter speeds you need for a sharp picture. And the inaccurate autofocus is yet another spanner in the works. There are some other image quality issues. The quality of the out of focus areas, or bokeh, is pretty hit and miss. Blurry backgrounds often look busy and a little distracting, and points of light have colourful highlights. On a related note, the lens also has problems with longitudinal chromatic aberration. That's when the out of focus areas pick up colourful highlights. On this picture, you can see that the black music has turned green beyond the point of focus and purple in front of it. Even stopping the lens down to f8 doesn't help. This is a common problem for many camera lenses, but it's worse than usual on this Tamron lens. This annoying longitudinal chromatic aberration can take you by surprise even in everyday pictures. The writing on this picture is meant to be black. Finally, well, I'll let you judge for yourself how well this lens works against bright light. One good thing about the lens is that it shows very little distortion, and neither is there much vignetting in the corners. But this is just what you'd expect from using a full-frame camera lens on an APS-C digital camera. I do feel like I'm being a little harsh. I want to defend this lens a bit, but it's just not easy. It is possible to use this lens to get some sharpish images for yourself for a very small amount of money. But it's such a fight to get there, and there are just so many image quality problems, and the build quality is so awkward. You really get what you pay for here. If you want to see how much Tamron have improved their lenses recently, then compare this to my review of Tamron's newer VC USD version of this lens, which is great. If you really want a cheap telephoto lens, just save a little more money and get the Canon 55-250mm IS, which is a much better lens in every way and also has image stabilization. This old-fashioned Tamron lens is not something I can recommend at all.